I've now launched 179 podcasts for clients around the world, for actors, athletes, influencers, businesses, brands. I speak to is people who've maybe got a bit of a following on like an Instagram or a LinkedIn. And the first question is, well, how do I get sponsors for my podcast? Like, if that's the way you're coming to it, you're coming to it from the wrong place.
Today's episode is all about podcasts. That's right. We're going to talk about podcasts, the stats involved, why you should have a podcast, why you shouldn't have a podcast, and how podcasting can really help you build your personal brand and your business.
The average consumption of a podcast is about 80% of the episode. So let's say, for example, so for there's 400 million people have downloaded a podcast last month, 80% of that episode got listened to. The average length is between sort of 30 and 45 minutes of a podcast.
Today's guest is James Burtt. Now, he's the founder of Phonic Media, and what he does is helps people that have a podcast idea take it from grassroots and turn it into something special.
The most underrated things of doing a podcast is
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. Today's episode is all about podcasts. That's right, we're going to talk about podcasts, the stats involved, why you should have a podcast, why you shouldn't have a podcast, and how podcasting can really help you build your personal brand and your business. And today's guest is James Burtt. Now, he's the founder of Phonic Media, and what he does is helps people that have a podcast idea take it from grassroots and turn it into something special. Let's get stuck in. All right, folks, let me tell you about IOPN, the Internet of People. IOPN is the next iteration of the Internet, using revolutionary blockchain technology that's built on decentralized community ownership. Now, when I say decentralized community ownership, I mean it's not only controlled by a bunch of tech giants. Instead, everyone who's part of it has a say and a stake in how things run. It gives regular people like me and you and businesses and brands an easy and fair chance to grow and make some money and build communities. IOPN is making things happen through a few key verticals. Now let's go through them. OPN Chain is a cutting-edge layer 1 blockchain that's efficient, scalable, and eco-friendly. iCognitive, a set of AI tools changing how we develop apps. Yeah, develop apps. OPN Verse, a dynamic, hyper-realistic, AI-powered platform that's making Web3 experiences better. Big organizations like Dubai Multi-Commodities Center, Dubai World Trade Center, and Ras Al Khaimah government are already seeing the potential with IOPN themselves. It's about creating a Web3 future where technology serves us, us, the people, unlike what Web2 did, where we often end up serving big tech companies. Check out the Internet of People today and see how you can leverage their ecosystem. I promise you, it's worth the time. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's interesting, being a Mr. Podcaster yourself and working with so many different podcasts to get you on the show to talk about podcasts.
Exactly. I've been waiting 3 years, so I'm glad you finally took the bait. I only had to link you up with one of the best podcasters in the country for you to go, do you want to do my podcast? Oh yeah, cheers, Spence, I'll do that, thanks.
Brilliant.
Dropping subtle hints for the last part of 3 years, sure.
I had a friend of mine called Raj Gatecha who used to have a podcast called OPP. Other people's podcasts, where he used to review other people's podcasts.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Yeah, a really interesting way of looking at it, and he did it with some DJ that passed away just a week or so ago. What's his name? Not Fatboy. What's the guy's name? It'll come to me in a while. But anyway, he passed away. But he used to do this podcast where he'd review podcasts, and I thought that was really interesting because how do people know what podcast to listen to watch? Yeah. It's not like they get adverts on telly during the week or on the radio.
No.
So people stumble across podcasts by accident sometimes, or they stumble across podcasts from, someone says, oh, have you heard this? A recommendation, a word of mouth.
Still word of mouth is the number one thing. And one of the biggest challenges, I'm sure we'll get onto it, is discoverability. Like, how do you find a new podcast? Unless you're on a podcast app looking for a podcast, by which point you're already indoctrinated, like you're in the outside world, in the wild. Like, how do you get people? I know Global Radio, for example, they have billboards everywhere and they're advertising in tube stations. They're really trying to use old school media to push to like this new form of media, but that's only been in the last year. But discoverability, the person who solves the discoverability problem is the next Zuckerberg.
Interesting.
You heard it here first.
Okay. So let's talk about what you do, and so that everyone can get a good understanding of that. So tell us a bit about your journey in the podcasting world, what you do and how you help people.
So I started off in podcasting because I was a third radio presenter, which is ironic because we're in this beautiful sort of radio studio today. This is what I aspired to be 10 years ago. I worked for the ex-head of Radio 1, a guy whose nickname, self-given, was the Hatchet, because he just sacked everyone. And he had a meeting one day, and he sort of like laid down the law of this new radio station, how things are going to be done. And he phoned me the next day, and he said, James, it's Trevor. I won't say his full name, you can work it out. His first name is Trevor, and he calls himself the Hatchet. Google it, you'll work it out. And he said, how did you find the meeting yesterday? I said, Trevor, I thought it was interesting. I loved all your points. He said, fantastic. He said, because the first thing I'm doing is getting rid of you and your mate. I think you're dreadful. And I was like, oh, okay. Don't sugarcoat it, Trev. Like, tell me how you really think. And honestly, I don't know how you've got a job. To be fair, one of the regular features we did was called Cheese or Breeze, where we throw two lumps of cheese off a 4-story roof and see which one hit the car park first, and get the listeners to guess cheese or breeze, which one's going to hit the floor first. I thought it was genius. He did not agree. Anyway, so that was 2012-ish, and then I sat. And I found Lewis Howes, who I believe that you've had on this podcast.
Yes, Lewis has been on the podcast, yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, this is a thing. It's like radio, but with no one's your boss. I'm going to do that. Sat on the idea for half a decade, annoyingly. And in 2017, I was like, do you know what? I've just got to do it. If I'm ever going to do it, I've got to do this thing. So I did. And I'd worked for brands like Nando's and Thomas Cook and Nissan and BMW and these sorts of big brands doing their PR. And I thought, I'll just treat this podcast like the launch of a PR campaign. Bit grandiose because I was doing it in South East London off the dining room table, but it felt like the right thing to do. Interviewing people on Skype, if you remember that far back. And so I launched it, and I was sort of scrolling through the top 200 charts. I'm looking at 200 down to 100. And I was like, oh, it didn't work. My tactics didn't work. It's because I was looking at the wrong end of the charts. Because I was actually, Tim Ferriss was number 1, Gary Vee was number 3, and in between them, sandwiched like the meat of an influencer sandwich, was me at number 2 in the business charts with some artwork that my wife had just knocked up on Canva for me. And I was like, oh, it worked. And then everyone phoned me and said, well, how did you do it? The truth was I didn't have a clue what had worked. I just knew something had, but never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So I was like, yeah, I've got some systems and processes and a launch strategy. And that was 7 years ago. And I've now launched 179 podcasts for clients around the world, for actors, athletes, influencers, businesses, brands. And we do everything from launching to sort of the ongoing production, support, consultancy, and everything in between.
Wow. Okay. 1 second. Some of the audience, English is their second language. Just to slow down, because you and I will speed up really quick because we speak the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's understand that then. So why are podcasts important, and who's listening to them or watching them? Let's understand the statistics, because I think there's a lot of confused people out there. We know that there's in excess of 5 million podcasts that exist out there, but most of them don't go very far. Only a very small percentage seem to make it any distance. But who is it valuable for?
It's valuable for anyone who's got a message that they want to communicate and a target audience that they understand. If you're just jumping on the bandwagon because everyone, and I use it inverted commas there, everyone's got a podcast, then you shouldn't be doing it. And also the other sort of subset of people that I speak to is people who've maybe got a bit of a following on like an Instagram or a LinkedIn. And the first question is, well, how do I get sponsors for my podcast? Like, if that's the way you're coming to it, you're coming to it from the wrong place. You need to lead with value. You need to lead with information. What form of education, information or entertainment do you have to offer? And reverse engineer it backwards. In terms of who's listening, last month, 400 million people around the world listened to a podcast. So the numbers are huge. And to your point about there being 5 million podcasts, that's 5 million that have ever existed in the history of time. So podcasts have been going since 2003. So it's 21 years old now. So it's not a long time, but it's also longer than most people give it credit for. And of those podcasts that have ever existed in that time, only 380,000 put an active episode out last month. So
wow, so 380,000
yes.
Continual podcast episodes rather than 5 million.
Yes.
Well, that's a staggering difference,
I know.
isn't it?
So if all things were equal...
This is globally. So only, I think it's something like 90% of podcasts never get beyond episode 7. Don't know why. There's like a mystical thing about number 7. So if you're a podcaster watching or listening and you've just released episode 8, congratulations, you're in the top 10% of people in terms of commitment. I'm not saying about quality, but in terms of commitment.
But that's the statistic that most people give up because podcast, and you'll know this, you travel around the flipping world doing podcasts. It's not hard, we're not doing brain surgery on kids, do you know what I mean? But it is a challenge. It takes up a lot of time, effort, energy, enthusiasm, and to do it at the sort of level that you are, darting in and out of different countries and in different studios and lining up people and doing multiple episodes today, it is a bit challenging. It is hard work. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, it becomes yet another thing on their to-do list of the never-ending continual marketing mix. I've got to do my blog. I've got to do my LinkedIn post. I need to do my podcast this week. People just don't give it the sort of the credence that they maybe should, because if you get it right, it can be an absolute content engine for everything else that you're doing. But yeah, just to reaffirm that point, last month there was 400 million people, there were 400 million downloads of podcast episodes, and only 380,000 shows actually shared all of that audience.
Okay, well let's take that stat and take an understanding from most people as to if they're going to spend the time doing it, then there has to be a reward. Now, you say people talk about how am I going to get it sponsored? But the fact is, and I've learned this myself, a podcast isn't cheap. Even if you're simple,
especially how you do it.
Well, even if you were doing it the cheapest way, which would be Anchor as an app on your phone, 2 microphones, no video, just audio. Even that way, you still have to consider the amount of time it takes to plan, prepare, and then execute, and then edit, and then publish. So there's a lot of time that goes into that, and there's some specific skills required to be able to do that. And I know that there's AI tools that are making some part of it easier, but there has to be some form of reward for the person that's putting that time and effort in. Yeah. Not necessarily money, but there has to be some form of there has to be a reward. So where do you think what are the benefits of having a podcast for people?
If you are an expert or you're trying to build authority in your marketplace, again, if you are someone who's got a message to share and you've got a target audience that you want to share it with, then I think a podcast is probably the number one thing that you can be doing for expert authority and building your brand within that sector, in that space. In terms of like radio traditionally has always been the most trusted form of media, but podcast is fast taken over from that. It's the most trusted form of media that there is. The other thing that, again, without getting too sort of statistics, I'm a right stats geek for
stats
for
are good. Let's do
stuff.
Stats.
Okay, so the average consumption of a podcast is about 80% of the episode. So let's say, for example, for there's 400 million people have downloaded a podcast last month, 80% of that episode got listened to. The average length is between sort of 30 and 45 minutes of a podcast. But they did some stats in the UK and they said, how long do you listen for? And the average came out at about 24 minutes. So let's just take that as the number, right? So there's 24 minutes and people will listen to 80% of that content. So that gets you to about 18 to 20-ish minutes. How valuable would it be for your brand and your business if your ideal target market listen to what you've got to say for 18 to 20 minutes every single week?
Well, let's compare that then so people can get some context here. If you compared that to making a video on YouTube, what's the average watch time on a video on YouTube?
It's about 3 seconds before people bounce off it. And about the drop off is 90% in the first 2 minutes. So let's say you do a 30-minute video and there's the same amount of people that are watching it. Most of them have gone in the first 2 minutes. That's why you see Mr. Beast and Jake Paul and all these people do something really sort of clickbaity at the beginning. It's why, the people who produce your podcast will have to hook people with a trailer with some sort of sensational clip, which I haven't given yet, by the way, keep watching. But they'll have to do that to hook people to make them want to watch beyond that sort of 90-second mark. Whereas podcast is just not that way. It's a really weird form of media where people, that whole thing of like people have to buy into you or they have to buy into you before they will buy from you. There's nothing more powerful than a podcast.
Well, let's think about that as well then. So are people mainly listening rather than watching?
It's shifting massively. So from 2017 when I first got into it, it was primarily a listening medium. But I think the big shift, and if you are a content maker out there, I think this is really important. Your podcast is no longer just a piece of audio. It's a show. This is a production. It's why you've gone to the effort of being in a room like this today, because unfortunately, the battle for long form attention is being fought in short form platforms. So the likes of Reels, the likes of Shorts on YouTube, the likes of little videos on LinkedIn. You've seen all of the platforms go from sort of square or landscape videos to now portrait, because Instagram sort of changed the game with it, and then TikTok and Vine and Snapchat and all those platforms came along. So you've got to capture people with short form content to make them want to listen to the longer form content. So that the whole thing is, at the moment, there's still more people listening than watching, but I think that will change in the next 24 months. I think it will go even. I did a poll on recently on LinkedIn, and 55% of people said that they listen or they consumed a podcast via YouTube. And I think that's the way that it's going to go in the next few years. By the way, there is still a place for beautiful podcasts that are audio only. Because again, a lot of people think you have to do the video thing. You absolutely don't, but it 100% harms your reach if you're not doing it. So Holly Tucker, who's the founder of Not on the High Street, I heard her this year at the podcast show, and she was talking about the fact that she doesn't do video because she's got these amazing women who are creating businesses that are bespoke and beautiful, and she doesn't want it to be about the video. She wants, because some people be talking about like why they created a hat brand because of their own alopecia. She doesn't want to make them feel uncomfortable in front of a camera, but she said on that conversation, but I know that is harming the reach. At the same time, on that same panel, we had Spencer Matthews, who's a guy was made in Chelsea and now has an alcohol-free brand, and he does a load of podcasts for Global and that kind of stuff. He's just done 30 days running in the desert or something. And he said, well, conversely, I don't understand how you can promote a show at all if you haven't got the clips. How are you even doing that? So you just got to, but it goes back to, your original question, which is, you've got to know why you're doing this podcast. The first question you should ask yourself is, what does podcast success look like for me? You don't have to be the next high performance. You don't need to be the next Bartlett. You don't need to be the next Lewis Howes. What does it need to do for you, your brand, your business, and maybe just your life for it to be a success, and then build it according to that?
Okay, so we look at the biggest ones in the world. Joe Rogan, he goes across many different subjects. It's like he almost doesn't niche at all on purpose. When you look into even Stephen Bartlett's, he jumps across different spaces, a lot of well-being, but he does jump across lots of different spaces, and they're really successful. Chicken Shop, again, interviews random people from random places. But then you're talking about niching down. Now, I understand why you would niche down, but how comes the ones that aren't niched tend to do well as well?
I think they're the exception rather than the rule. And if you look at them, they've already got a massive profile that they can bring to the party. Again, you look at Stephen Bartlett, for example. He ran a media agency and a marketing agency. He knows how to get attention on stuff. He was running Facebook meme groups in 2016. That's where the attention was. He was then really heavy on Telegram when he first launched his podcast. He knew where the attention was and went with it. And I think that's it's a really good point that you bring up, because you could look at, like Chris Williamson, another Modern Wisdom, brilliant podcast, very well executed. And he would talk about transcendental meditation, ayahuasca retreats, or, how to launch a book. He would go for these random subjects. But again, because he's already got the attention, he's already got a couple of million followers on YouTube. He's got a few million on Instagram. So I would say, again, another great example is his business partner, James Smith. He will do a podcast whenever he bloody feels like it. He has got no, I'll post it weekly, fortnightly, monthly. He just fancies doing one and does one. But he is the exception rather than the rule. And again, it goes back to the aim of what you're trying to do it for. If you are trying to build a brand utilising a podcast, if you want to be the expert authority in your space, then speak your message to the ideal target market and give them exact value. You can and I always say to people, niche down first and broaden out after. Again, if you listen to what Bartlett did, Diary of a CEO, it's not even about being a CEO anymore. Like Jimmy Carr did the whole joke thing about it when he was on the podcast. Like, when was the last time you spoke about business, Stephen? He said, you just get people in here and make them cry. Like, you're a therapist. You're not a business person. What are you talking about? But he was documenting his weekly thoughts as a CEO, hence Diary of a CEO. Same with high performance, for example. They went after athletes, and now they sort of broadened out, and then they've gone back down the athlete route. They found what's worked for them. The other thing you've got to bear in mind, Joe Rogan is the one that comes up all the time. How come Joe Rogan can do it? Because he is 17,000 times more intelligent than the rest of us mere mortals. He can God knows how, smoke as much weed as he likes and still talk deeply about the brain and psychology and fighting. But he is the exception rather than the rule. So my advice for people building a brand, niche down and then broaden out.
Okay, so let's take a subject and say we were going to focus on that. So I mentioned a lady that did one with body dysmorphia.
Yes.
So she does body dysmorphia. So she's essentially speaking to people that have got problems with their own image of how they look, their weight or lack of, and all of the challenges around that. So that to me seems like a niche enough subject. Yeah. And she very much cares about people that have gone through these challenges because she was one herself. So she makes this podcast. How does she find the audience that she needs to niche into? So she has a niche subject. How does she find that audience, number one? And number two, how does that ever turn into a time equaling return on investment type of strategy?
Yeah, so what she would do, I think personally, is make that podcast that is in line with the values that she's got and the goal that she has got. What, again, goes back to what form of education, information or entertainment does she think that audience wants? Then you do maybe 10 episodes of that. While you're doing that, you're making those clips. So you're making a trailer, you're pulling out short form clips, you're doing slightly longer form clips that will work for LinkedIn, you're trying to put it onto YouTube, you're then doing a shorter version of the podcast for YouTube you can put out a couple of times a week, you're trying shorts. And then put it out there and see. You will see, because of the algorithms, the stuff that resonates with that audience. That's what I'll be doing first and foremost. The other thing, even though it's niche, so to start with, she might be talking about her own journey. Then she might talk about to somebody else who's got body dysmorphia. But then she might find that actually, do you know what? There's a big psychological aspect of body dysmorphia, of course, as well as physiological. So she talks to a psychologist. Then she might talk to a PT. Then she might talk to a fashion designer. Then she might talk to a surgeon. So all of these, there's like sub niches within it. And again, by making that content, making those clips, then you'll find what does the audience want more of. Then if you're really clever about it and if you're really committed to it, if you're putting content out, like you've got a great audience who watches your stuff, listens to your stuff, you can now, because of how long you've been doing it, you can say, hey, I'm going to do a new season of the podcast. What would you like me to do it about? Your audience will actually tell you. Now, you could obviously say, do you want it to be about business or making money or health or mental well-being? You could sort of break it down to the 4 subsets that you actually want to talk about in the first place. Because if they're like, oh, do a whole series on, ayahuasca retreats, you're like, no, I don't really want to do that. So you could sort of funnel them into the right direction, but literally just ask that audience. And then what you'll also find is that when you're speaking to that audience deeply, you'll work out what other things you can offer to that audience. In that example with the gastric band, well, she might think, oh, actually, I should do an ebook about how to prep for the surgery. I'll do an ebook about how to get over the surgery. I'll do a mini series or a sub series or a course about how to recover from gastric surgery. I will then do a diet book that's about how to reintroduce food after gastric surgery. And I don't know this subject, so I'm making up a load of stuff. There's probably doctors going, you shouldn't be saying that. It's the wrong advice, man.
Yeah, but it's good though. It's good.
But it's that sort of thing, and you can extend, and that sort of goes to, you've got your niche subjects, and then you can broaden out from there. So she might find that she has a course, she might have a retreat, she might end up with a TV show, she might find that she's the expert authority going on to different radio stations, she might find a big audience on LinkedIn.
Partnering with a nutritionist.
Exactly that, okay.
Yeah. So there's a revenue source by doing stuff
Yes.
like that, yeah? Somebody introduces a book that isn't hers, but she promotes their book and gets the benefit of that. So all of these...
Maybe the surgeon that she went to, she does a referral setup. She can help her audience. She can genuinely give them information, entertainment, and stuff that they want, but at the same time can create a really good brand and monetizable business off the back of it.
And when she thinks about how she reaches that audience, do you think she has to spend money on running her content to a specific audience? And can if you were running content with an agency or doing it yourself, can you niche into that area when you search on a Facebook or Meta platform and say, I want people that have got body dysmorphia, or is that a step too far right now?
You could. What I would say, again, it depends on what the outcome is. If she's already got a business, if there's already money there, like ads or whatever are just going to speed up the process. You just throw fuel onto the fire, but ultimately you have have to have the fire burning to start with. So you could look at, and this is what I'd be doing. I'd be doing Google Trends. You know, what are the most searched trends for body dysmorphia? Okay, cool. Well, can I make content around those clips? Can I go on to TikTok, which I'm not a fan of, by the way, but can I go onto there and look, what are people most searching for? Who are the biggest body dysmorphia influencers per se on that platform? Same with Instagram, same with Facebook. Where do I go and find those people, go into those groups and have those conversations and look at what the subjects that people are looking most for? Go onto LinkedIn and put a poll up, go onto Facebook and put a poll up if there's already these groups. School by Alex Hormozy, a great platform. There's so many subsets of people in real niche industries on there. Go in there, join the conversation, put a poll up and find, so you don't have to chuck money at it to start with. I would find a foundation of what is it that these people actually really want to start with, and then as soon as you see the grass shoots of something, then maybe you can chuck some money at it just to accelerate either your ability to capture data, because everyone thinks that when you run a Facebook ad or a Meta ad or whatever, if you don't land the lead then you've lost the lead. Well, no, because you've got the data. So who clicked on what were you know, if you're A/B testing body dysmorphia podcast or reintroducing food, or you could run a bunch of A/B tests on Facebook with very little money, by the way, like $5-10 a day. It doesn't have to cost you a fortune, but that data will tell you what are people most interested in.
Okay. And let's talk about the people's confidence, because people fear being on camera and they fear being on the mic and worry about how they look or whether they've got anything valuable to say. This is one thing I get a lot. It's like, I have nothing of any value to talk about.
Yeah.
But I often find that those people that fear is because they really know their subject and it's become part of their subconscious.
Yeah.
So it's just a norm for them.
Yeah, that's it.
You know, for people like you and I listening to them, we're like, wow, that's really interesting. You know, I never knew that. But they're like, doesn't everyone know that?
Well, that's exactly it. You kind of get wood for the trees-itis. You don't know because you're in it. You can't see it, if that makes sense. I remember I interviewed Gary Brecker, who's a world-leading human biologist, and this was before he became the Gary Brecker, who's now like the chief medical officer or whatever of UFC and Grant Cardone's business partner and all that kind of stuff. And he couldn't believe I went to Miami to interview him. This was years ago, 2019. And he couldn't believe that I'd gone all the way there to him. He's like, what are we going to talk about? I was like, well, you know, and the fact that breath work can make you live like 10 years longer, and the fact that you know about the mitochondria and all this sort of stuff. He's like, oh, is that going to be interesting for people? I was like, yes, Gary, it is. Sit down and let's do the talking. So that's one of the things that people get. And I worked with a former CEO of a couple of very big travel companies. You know, he'd run 2 separate billion-dollar companies. And we went for lunch. He's like, well, what am I going to talk about from a personal brand perspective, or if I went on podcasts? Like, you run 2 separate billion-dollar companies. Have you learned some lessons? Well, yeah, I guess so, but who wants to hear it? Well, everyone who's trying to build a billion-dollar travel company, and lots of other people as well. But he just didn't realise that his journey and his experience would be of value. Now, the biggest issue that people have is they feel like it's bragging. Oh, look at my stuff, look what I'm doing, look what I'm doing. It just feels like a brag. If you just say what you've done or what you've got and you don't share a lesson or a learning, for sure, that's bragging. But if you tell people how you did it or the lesson that you learned on the way to getting the car, the house, the life partner, whatever, that's branding, not bragging. If you teach people a lesson, that is branding and not bragging. And you kind of just have to a little bit get over yourself. The other thing for people who, especially the first time they hear themselves back in headphones, like, oh, I sound really different. Well, because you actually hear yourself differently. So when you hear it through headphones, it's going through your eardrum. When you hear yourself talking now, you're actually listening through the bones in your ears. So when you go, oh, I sound really different, yeah, because you actually physiologically do. But after a couple of times, you just kind of get used to it. Mm-hmm. And the biggest thing that I say to people is there will be someone who was in your position at some stage. You've gone from where you were to where you are right now. Where you are might not be where you want to be ultimately in the long term, but it's a million miles ahead of somebody else. If you've got a learning or a lesson that can move somebody else and improve their life, then you should feel indebted to do that thing, even if it makes you feel uncomfortable. And all good things are on the other side of discomfort, aren't they, ultimately?
Yes, they are, indeed. Okay, let's talk about internal communications in companies. Because I look at big companies and I think about how, you know, gossip often starts because of someone misinterpreting an email or somebody standing up in front of a group of people and having an off day, or there being Chinese whispers throughout an office building. And
You've been in a few of these companies then.
No. But when I look at that, I'm like, if every company, every mid-size and upwards company had a podcast that was just internal, wasn't even external, just internal, that every week they were sharing information about the company, they were interviewing different employees in their roles so people could understand more, they were talking to people in HR and recruitment and all kinds of different areas, just educating the employees on what's going on, giving them updates, getting them excited, maybe running some competitions as well. This is all internal. Do you think, number one, that that's valuable for a company? And do you think, number two, the employees would be inclined to listen?
I think it's an amazingly powerful thing that less than 1% of companies are doing, which is staggering. You can do what's called a private podcast. So you could actually do a podcast that is specifically not for public consumption. So only people with that exact URL would be able to listen to it. So it's not going to get outside, if that makes sense. Especially if you've got, I think even more so nowadays when 90% of the workforce is working hybrid or entirely at home, or it's this sort of wishy-washy, come in on a Tuesday, I can't come in on a Monday and a Friday and all that kind of stuff. I think it's so powerful. And exactly like I said, if the CEO took the time every single week, which would take 10 minutes of their time, hey guys, here's what's going on in the business this week. Here's where we're at. Here's what's going on with investor relations. And this week on the podcast, we're going to be focusing on HR. Here's Sally, who's our head of HR. And we're doing this, that, and the other. People think that company values is the thing that's sort of pinned up in the shiny reception area. And by the way, your staff only go there one day a week now, and they begrudge going in because, you know, they have to organise childcare for an after-school club on that day. So then when they walk past the shiny, here's our vision and our mission, and this is what we're doing, they don't really care that much, potentially. Some people will. But if you're telling them again and again and again, and you're nudging and reminding them, you talk about core values, your USPs, your mission statement, what you're doing as a company. Number one, you're making people want to work harder for you. I think you'll get better people working for you as well. And the other thing is that people, if you nudge and remind them all the time, then it's easier to live those values. You know, how many people have been to a job interview and they're like, okay, at this company, thanks for coming in, Spencer. At this company, we are this, that, and the other. That's the last time you ever hear that core value. But if the CEOs talk about it again and again, I think it's super powerful. The other thing, I think other big organisations, not just companies, like schools, why on earth are more schools not doing private podcasts that go out every single Friday to the parents of that school? Hey, this is what we've been working on this week. This week, we took the kids to the circus and we learned, the reason why we took them to the circus is because we were learning about symmetry. And they could see all these different shapes and blah, blah, blah. And here's little Johnny. Oh, when I went to circus, it was amazing. I saw a trapezoid. Brilliant. Thanks, Jimmy. Like, again, not the most exciting content unless you're one of the parents of that school. And that organisation potentially has got, a couple of thousand people who've got a vested interest. They're stakeholders. Their kids are there every single week. How many people are listening to? And parents will know this. They've got parent mail. You're beyond this time now, but you've got parent mail and emails and text messages and the WhatsApp groups between the parents, and you got the PTA. But if there's one single source of truth almost every single Friday, here's the little half an hour summary of what's going on at this XYZ primary school, that'd be mega. And people actually consume the content.
Then we look at that and we start to think about how that company then can use that as a tool to demonstrate to the rest of the world. I think about if you make it internal only, that's one thing. But have you heard of BFBS?
Yes.
Okay, so British Forces Broadcasting Service.
Yeah.
So my parents live in Cyprus.
Ah, okay.
And we have a lot of Greek Cypriot radio.
Yes.
Which isn't... well, I don't understand what they're saying anyway. But they have two BFBS stations in Cyprus. And so when you're there, you listen to it, and it's for the troops.
Yeah.
So that's almost like a company, a group of people.
Yeah.
That content is specific for.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Here's the music. And it takes me back to... Good morning, Vietnam.
Yeah.
When they had the radio show that was in Vietnam and they were playing the songs and updating people of what was going on in the Mekong Delta and stuff like that. And although that was comedy, the BFBS is a very serious station that is for the troops. And so it would almost be that is kind of like an example that's been around for many years. And if you pulled that back and said, okay, we're not a military group, but we're a group of people together. We're a community. We're a collective of a number. Let's make sure that we continually feed these people constant information that is valuable for them and enables them to understand the company better, understand the people better, understand how to communicate better. Because, for example, we talk about mental health. It's become this thing, When I was young, it didn't exist. Mental health was for people that were in the loony asylum type of stuff, And then everybody else was just like, get over yourself and deal with your dramas, pull your sleeves up, suck it in and get back on. But when you think about the challenges of mental health within organisations, if there's 1,000 people, there might be a percentage of people that are struggling and suffering.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, let's have the experts to come in and talk about that kind of subject as well, and help add value to the employees too.
We I can't say the brand, but we were in sort of elongated talks until the legal department put a pin in it. But this was actually for a delivery company. And they said, we've got no way. Our guys and girls literally come in at 5 o'clock in the morning, get the van gets loaded, they go off for the day, they come back, they drop the van off, they go home. We have got no touch points. We've got no reason to have a touch point with them. We've got no way to build know, like and trust. It's hard to build a community. People don't feel, that's why they had such a high staff turnover, because it was transient. And they said there's just no culture, like we're struggling to build culture. So we want to do a private podcast that's just for our drivers. And in the end, the legal department were like, well, what happens if it's, if somebody crashes while they're listening to it? I was like, I promise you, an internal podcast from your CEO won't be that exciting that somebody crashes a van, which did not go down well in the meeting, by the way. I have to say, talked myself out of that job, but it was the truth. But it was an amazing insight, because I was like, yeah, actually, these guys and girls are on the road 10, 12 hours a day. They have got no touch point. They've got, other than just, are you from XYZ company? But they haven't got any community built into it. But your point about BFBS, and I love this actually, I think private podcasts are super powerful for your internal team, but why not do what BFBS has done? So make it only because it's really for the troops. It's not there to serve your mum and dad. They don't really care if, they're off to Paralimni or wherever it is down on the beach, but they make the content in a way that resonates with their ideal target audience, but still broadly speaks to a wider audience as well. You know why those troops are there. You know why they're on the island. You get a sense of what BFBS is about, what the military service is about through that radio station.
But let's take another example, because let's say it was Sainsbury's. Sainsbury's has their customers. Yep. They're essentially an international brand, but let's take the UK, and they have their thousands of employees. Why is there not a podcast for everybody that has a touch point with Sainsbury's?
Yeah.
The suppliers and all of that, plus the customers.
Yeah.
And there was something that went out every week teaching people about, what would that do for me if I was a Sainsbury's customer? Would I listen to it every week if it was interesting? Okay. Would it make me more loyal to Sainsbury's if it was interesting?
Yeah.
Would it make me think about Sainsbury's before I thought about Tesco's or another brand? If it was interesting. So there's some real value there, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. You make
by taking it out, and rather than it being just an internal corporate
for
communications, it could be a broader thing.
What someone like a Sainsbury's probably will do, though, is that they'll make a podcast and they'll get like a Jamie Oliver or whoever's like the sort of the chef of the day, and they will try and spit it out to that wider demographic and audience. But like I say, but what about those stakeholders? What about those people who work for the company? What if I could hear about the journey of, like, how do you pick a farm? What is the process of deciding who's going to be your butcher? What is that process of that? And would that make me go in there? Yeah, 100% would. If I was going, I know where this meat has come from, I know where this vegetable comes from, because I just see this thing in a packet, but what does it actually take to get this into a shop and then furthermore onto my plate? And I think you can actually build a deeper level of connection. This is what I think podcasts are really good for connection. Rather than just trying to say, like in a Sainsbury's example, if you can have better stakeholder relations, the stakeholders are anyone who's got a vested interest in your company. It's not just the person who's giving you the pound note, it's everyone around it. Because if you haven't got the staff, you can't take the pound note. If you haven't got the stock, you can't have the thing in the shop to take the pound note. So I think a broader look at stakeholders for bigger companies is definitely preferable when it comes to podcast content, for sure.
Okay, so let's go back then to us all having our own podcast for whatever reason that is, and think about, now we've committed to doing it. We know it's a use of our time. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're publishing one episode a week. Maybe that means one weekend a month we're filming.
Yeah.
Okay, and editing's being done and whatnot. Let's just imagine that's the case. We put it out there and people give us nice feedback, but we don't get any more than that. No one's approaching us saying, "Hey, we really like your podcast. Can we give you some money?" Then,
damn it,
they're not saying, "Can we sponsor your podcast?" We really like your podcast and we would love to buy you diamonds. None of that's taking place. So how does that person that started that podcast, and let's go back to these numbers and reaffirm, 5 million podcasts, of which 380,000 of them had a downloaded episode last week. So there's only 380,000 globally really that are live, maybe a bit more, but roughly that kind of number. So how does the person doing it? Let's take me. Okay, I mean, people will know that I have sponsors, but let's take that example. Okay, with 330 episodes in, or whatever the number is, I've proven that I'm committed to the program.
Yeah, of that there is no doubt.
I've spent the money on the equipment. I've built the studios. I've spent the time with the guests. I've flown to different countries to interview people. I pay for studios like this. Another example, to interview you today and the next guest. And I need to make money. Okay, so what are my ways of making money out of using this piece of media? Because if I wasn't doing this, maybe I'd be running Facebook ads to make money. Maybe I'd be doing something to make money. And I go back to the beginning of time, and it was the cold calling and the door knocking, and then you now move forward. How do I make money out of my podcast? And I don't want a but. I want to like give me the terms, the rules, the black and white. The if you do this, you can make money.
What I'd be doing, especially if you're a newer creator, so if you've got a new podcast, you are not one of the big 100 in the country, what I would be doing is I would look at who is advertising on those sorts of podcasts. I'd be going onto their YouTube channels, I'd be going onto their LinkedIn, I'd be looking at who are they already connected with.
So let's take an example.
So let's say, for example, you want to, let's use Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO. That's a really good example.
It's a really successful one, though.
Really successful podcast. But let's say, for example, you are talking to business people and you're having those sorts of conversations. I'd look at who is sponsoring Stephen Bartlett. Now, obviously, you've got the people who are actually on the podcast. So in his example, you've got Huel, you've got Mercedes, you've got
let's do that slowly so people know. So Huel is an energy drink.
Yes.
Kind of thing, yeah?
So, nutritionally complete meal, Spencer.
A nutritionally complete.
Okay, an energy drink,
that I've tasted, that I'm not a massive fan of, but that's just
That's
me.
your sponsorship dead in the water then?
You have Mercedes.
Yep.
You have American Express.
Yeah.
Who else does he have?
He has Uber. I think he's done some stuff with
some of his own brands.
A lot of his own brands. Perfect Head
promoted. LinkedIn Jobs.
Okay, yeah.
So now you know that. Let's take the average person. They now can see that Bartlett has the Diary of a CEO has these sponsors. What's my next step?
So then I'd be going onto YouTube. So I'd be looking at not only the sponsors of the actual podcast, but then there'll be people who can place adverts on YouTube channels.
Okay, now I'm too complicated. What does that mean?
So if you went onto his video every 10 minutes or so, unless he's turned the adverts off.
Let's say we see American Express.
Yeah.
Now what do I do?
So I would actually be reaching out to that PR department.
PR department of who?
Of American Express.
So how would I find their details?
And companies like that, you'd Google press department, American Express UK press department.
Okay, so I'd reach out to them and then I'd say what?
And I'd be pitching my show to them.
So I'd create a pitch.
Create a pitch deck. So who is your show? Who is it for? Why does it resonate with them? The fact that that they're after a certain type of audience, much like Steve, and it'd be very bespoke for each person, much like Stephen's audience, ours is 90% entrepreneurs and business owners, blah, blah, blah. This is the number of episodes, this is the reach that we've got, and literally cold sell the value of your podcast and look for brands in that way. But
what if they say, yeah, but you have 300 downloads a week or 3,000 downloads a week? It's like, is going for a brand like American Express maybe a bit ambitious?
It might be. So then what you'd potentially do is look at American Express's content and who are their competitors. So then you could go down the line. American Express is maybe a bad example because of how big it is as an organisation. But there'll be like Tide, for example, a banking app who are going after small entrepreneurs, or Starling or Monza or one of those organisations. So I'd effectively start with my dream client, and then, not in a bad way, but sort of work your way down from there and look at those competitor banks. Go, right, okay, we've only got 3,000 people within our audience, but they are super proactive. Why don't we do an affiliate deal to start with? So you give us a code. So maybe we do it for no money to start with, for a 6-week basis. You give us an exclusive affiliate code, and let's see how much traffic we can drive. I would then also potentially, without it being too complicated, instead of driving it just to their affiliate link, I'll potentially send them to a landing page. so I could pixel that landing page. So then I'm collecting the data as well. So then for my next time round, I could go to, let's say, for example, Tide Bank are going after entrepreneurs and we do an affiliate, and for whatever reason, they go, yeah, it wasn't for us, thanks very much. If I've been running people to that landing page, I've now got a bunch of data. So I can go to Monzo Bank and say, yeah, we've already worked with the likes of Tide Bank and we've got this bunch of data. We've got this many people on our mailing list. Would you like to sponsor our podcast? We are for the small businesses that you're after.
So to get a sponsor, it's like any other sale. I've got to reach out to 100 people and hopefully one or two say yes.
Yeah, I honestly believe that at the start. Once you've got a critical mass, like now, you'll probably get offered sponsorships. You probably get a couple in your inbox every day because of how long you've been doing it. And
I don't.
Really?
No, I don't.
Okay, well then I'd be doing this tactic even if I was you.
So when I look at sponsorship for my podcast, most people that sponsor my podcast aren't that interested in the podcast. What they're interested in is who I can open doors to them for.
Right, okay.
So it's interesting how they're like, yeah, give us your black book, or we want to speak to the guests.
Well, you make that as a prerequisite of you only connect people if they sponsor your podcast, don't you?
Correct.
Yeah, so that is a great way. If you've got a black book like not everyone's got a black book of connections like yours, but if they have, again, opening your personal network to those sorts of people, amazingly powerful.
But again, I suppose when you take me out of the equation and let's go back to the lady with the body dysmorphia podcast. If you think about it, she can do something similar because the audience that, or the black book that she has after interviewing 100 people are going to be valuable to the surgeon.
Yeah, for sure.
Are going to be valuable to the insurance company, the medical insurance company, are going to be valuable to the nutritionist, etc. So she's actually got, even though it might be small at the beginning, just through her black book of 100 guests, probably got some opportunities to pair people up.
But to your point there, and I like your thinking with that, but just the first 100 guests on a weekly basis, that's 2 years. And this is the biggest challenge. Most people will not see this through. Most people, unfortunately, they look at it like a TikTok or an Insta or whatever. If you don't get a viral post or a viral episode, I'm trying to get, Tony Robbins has been on your podcast. Do you know how many people must reach out to that guy? Probably 10,000 a day. Thinking that Tony Robbins is going to be the thing that clicks their podcast and makes it explode. I hate to tell you this, but it's actually not. If you haven't got an audience there, it's like a tree falling down the woods. Does it actually make a sound? I've had a very, very, very big influence from my podcast a couple of years ago, and I tracked the number of leads that they generated from their posts because I gave them a specific code. It was 96 downloads. This was someone who had millions of followers. 96 people were that bothered to come and listen to the long form content. So and I think you've accidentally stumbled on a great lesson there. You've got to be in this for the long term. And obviously you're sitting there, people would be going, well, of course, you're the podcast guy. You're going to say that. Oh, why don't I pay your agency? And we'll just sit on it for 5 years. Yeah, lovely. But it really does take time. A mate of mine, James Sinclair, he said, same with his podcast and YouTube. It did not move the needle for the first 3 years.
I asked Lewis House.
Did you?
Yeah,
What did he say?
When did you start making money from your podcast?
What did he say?
He said, I didn't know what I was doing until I did 500 episodes.
Really?
He said, I didn't have a clue. He said, and he goes, and I don't think at 500 I just all of a sudden knew.
Yeah, the clouds didn't part,
But some luck came my way and it was like, oh.
Yeah.
But 500 episodes before you get anywhere.
Yeah.
So that obviously is a real commitment.
Yeah.
There have been times along the way that I've thought, why am I doing this?
And why? In those moments, what's your answer to yourself?
So I look at the different ways of making money from the podcast. If I just look at it from a revenue point of view, and obviously you have sponsors, but can I do business with the people that are guests? And so, let's say I was selling something. I don't know. Let's say I was selling, office equipment, and I had a podcast. I'd be wanting to list down the decision makers in my top 100 companies.
Yeah.
And I would have a podcast with those 100 people. And then after the podcast, I'd call them 2 weeks later and say, I just want you to know that everyone loves you. It's a fantastic episode.
Yeah. Can
I buy you a coffee? Because I've got a few ideas that I think might be valuable for you. Now, that person is always going to say yes. You had an hour and a half with them and got to know them, yeah? So now I have this coffee with them and I'm like, you don't know what I do. Can I share that with you? I tell them. And you're not the decision maker, I'm sure. Who's the decision maker in your company for your laser printing or whatever it may be. Okay, oh, that's Maureen. Okay, Maureen in supplies.
You have got niche here. Laser printing with Maureen.
but Maureen's the person I need to speak to. Now, let's say that's a company that buys 100 laser printers every year. Maybe if I'm selling office equipment, okay, that's really valuable. And if I interview 100 people and I can convert 50 of them into a conversation that's deep and meaningful, and I can convert 25 into real opportunities, and I can convert 12 of those 100 into buying, and each one of those 12 is worth 20 grand, I've now got £240,000 that I've made from having a podcast.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
We've done this a lot with recruitment, especially. We do a lot of stuff for recruitment companies exactly for that reason, because the recruitment space is very linear. Hello, have you got a people requirement right now? No, I haven't. Okay, cool. Can I call you back in 6 months? But they'll ask permission. They're just going to phone back in 6 months. No relationship built. Yes or no? Bam. If the answer is yes, great. Can we, tender for the work? Brilliant. When you then go into that conversation, go, hey, such and such from XYZ recruitment company, we've got a podcast about insert niche here. We'd love to have you onto the podcast. Is that something that we could organise with you? Now you shifted the power dynamic entirely. Instead of going cap in hand as the salesperson or the person with the ask, now you're in the position of power. So exactly like you said, then you follow up with, hey, thanks so much for being on the podcast. We've got like a 4-step system that it sounds a bit contrived, but there's a 4-step sort of email sequence that you send to people after they've been on your podcast. Hey, thanks for being on it. It's amazing. I particularly like the section where you talked about X, Y, Z. So they know it's not just like a blanket email that you send to everybody. Then a couple of weeks later, hey, the production team have been working on the podcast. It sounds amazing. We're going to be sending you some clips and the full video and all this kind of stuff. Really hope you enjoy it. I think that your audience is going to get loads from it. Here's the link when it goes live. Then you actually send them the assets, make it easy for them. Now you've got your ideal audience there, or your ideal client buyer is now, you've built up know, like and trust for an hour and a half with them. You've made their job easy. You're giving them content. You've made them look and feel like a rock star. Exactly to your point. The next time you pick up the phone and go, hey, can we go and grab a coffee? The answer is always going to be yes. Or they're going to come to you with the ask instead. Hey, we've got this thing that we're looking to tender. Could you guys tender for it? But you've got to be aware that's what you're doing the podcast for.
Yeah, that's have that complete understanding. My podcast is a business development tool.
100 exactly. Yeah.
But I believe if people see it as a business development tool, they'll probably be more enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, rather than the episode number 7 and then coming to the end. If I podcasted and I was selling, let's go back to office equipment. I was selling office equipment and I reached out to 100 people and I had those people on my podcast. That is an incredibly powerful prospecting tool, because I've just spent an hour and a half building rapport with someone and bonding with them. So I'm no longer going to be cold calling them. I've already got my foot in the door, at least for a coffee. Now, of course, don't be naive to think everyone's going to buy from you, but surely as a sales tool.
Yeah. That's the other thing that we do a lot with. So we work with a lot of sort of consultants and experts. So instead of it being, we can almost pretty much get rid of the need for a discovery call. Because instead of getting on a discovery call with the prospect, say, hey, I know that let's say, for example, you're a life coach. Let's give a really broad example, because there might be a bunch of life coaches who watch well, actually, no, you've probably said so many bad things about life coaches. No one who's a life coach likes this show anymore. But let's say you're a coach of something. So someone wants to get on a discovery call with you. Instead of that, what I'd be suggesting is saying, look, I know that in this moment, it feels like your challenge that you're trying to get over is completely unique to you. And obviously it is right now. But I've worked with so many people who've got that same challenge. I tell you what, instead of us jumping on a call for an hour where I just tell you, you talk about your challenge and I try and sell to you, why don't we do a podcast episode? Let's record it. And I'll actually give you an hour's worth of free coaching and consultancy. And then, because then I can reuse that time, because I can help one-to-many, but I've helped you on a one-to-one basis. Would that be of value? Of course, we're brilliant. So what you're doing there is subconsciously you're selling to them the whole time, because you're showing them how good you are. And the other thing that you're doing for the 100, 10, 100,000, whatever it is, listeners that you've got, they're also now going, bloody hell, this guy or this girl really knows their stuff. I've got to work with them. It's one thing for you to say, hey, I'm brilliant at this thing. It's another thing for someone else to come to that realization on their own. And we've done that with loads of consultants. They're like, oh my God, I don't need to do discovery calls at all anymore. All of their leads come from podcasts. I know one guy who's and just in case someone's going, well, yeah, but I'm really, really niche. We had a podcast which was around ground investigation, so deep piling for one subsector. So this guy could potentially ever need 25 businesses. There's only 25 businesses in the UK that he could ever sort of need to work with. He had every single one of them in his podcast within 6 months. Every single one. And he stopped all other forms of advertising. We had a hypnotherapist who was doing thousands on Google and Facebook ads. I think he's just gone over 9 million downloads or something like that. He's turned off all of his other adverts because he's like, I can't deal with the leads. Literally can't deal with the leads. He's got a place down the road in Harley Street now, and he's a keynote speaker at all the big hypnotherapy conferences, whatever happens at those places. Just off the back of a podcast. Whatever happens.
Everyone's hypnotised.
That's like a chicken. Yeah, no one knows. Ask no questions. It's never filmed.
So we've gone through the steps here. So essentially, we've decided that we can start. Let's talk about starting up and the equipment that you would need when you start. Okay, and understand that for the beginner. So my firm belief is that everybody should start their podcast just in audio form for one important reason: to get good.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time people don't know how to do it. Mm-hmm. And so if I go back to my first 4 or 5 or 6 or maybe 20, podcasts, they weren't great. I thought they were great at the time, but they weren't really great.
Yeah.
I was interrupting people and, getting excited about what they were saying and, tone was wrong. But I believe that if everybody starts the cheapest way possible, that's to have an app on their phone, have an adapter on their phone or 2 Bluetooth mics. Okay, and just do an audio interview. So there was an awesome kid on my podcast called Finley Suchley. Okay, he was on about 4 or 5 months ago, and Finley loves food. All right, and he's had some challenges at school. He's the head boy of a school, lovely kid. And I thought to myself, he loves food. How cool would it be if he had a podcast where he interviewed chefs in their kitchens?
Yeah, very cool.
So he goes in, and he has an interview with them in the kitchen. While in the background, you can hear the chopping and the cooking and stuff like that. But it's audio.
Yeah.
And he, as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old boy, then is now interviewing these chefs from all of the top restaurants in Dubai. And I thought, how cool would that be? But that's not expensive.
No.
And he could do those on a weekend outside of school or in half terms and whatnot. And he literally would have a podcast. He'd get good at asking questions. He'd get good at talking. He'd get good at being inquisitive about the technology that goes with it. He probably could learn how to self-edit it as well. Mm. And to me, that's what a great way to start. Inexpensive. You then start to become good at what you do before you then move into the next level, which includes obviously cameras and microphones and stuff like that. What do you think about that approach?
Yeah, I think the idea of start now and get perfect later is always the right approach. Always the right approach. And this whole thing of like waiting for perfection or waiting for the right guest. Like my first guest was supposed to be an England footballer who just retired. I'm so glad it wasn't, because I listened back, I'm the same as you, it was horrific. I had like a God Save the Queen drum and bass anthem that I had as the beginning. I was like shouting down the microphone. I had like Tim Westwood start air horns going off. And at the time I was like, this is brilliant. I listened back now, I'm like, what the hell are you thinking? So start now and get perfect. To go back to the point of like the equipment with the Bluetooth microphones, there's so many good online platforms now. You don't even need to do that. Like you could go onto a platform like Riverside, which is basically like Zoom, but specifically for recording good quality content. You could use your laptop microphone, they could use their laptop microphone. It doesn't have to cost you a penny. You could go from Riverside, you could download that, you could then put it into like a free software that will do the compression and normalize it and make it sound all nice. And then to your point, you could put it on Anchor. Anchor's now called Spotify for podcasters, but you could syndicate it all around the world for absolutely nothing. It could cost you zero to run that podcast. But what you don't get by doing that is you don't get the in-person, face-to-face relationship. And that is, again, one of the most underrated things of doing a podcast is being with the person, having a coffee before, having a coffee with them after, going and grabbing lunch. That relationship is the thing that's actually oftentimes the most valuable thing you're getting from the podcast. You think it's the conversation or the clips or whatever. It's not. It's actually the building of rapport.
You think about that, because that's something I think that's misunderstood. We get it, okay? If you went out and did 50 episodes and you added 50 people to your black book that you could add value to and they could add value to you, I wonder what price you'd have to put on that.
Yeah, you can't put a price on it,
even if you were not selling them anything, okay, and no agenda to do so. Yeah. What value is in that? And that, I don't do podcasts online. I don't like to do them online.
No, that's fair enough.
I like people to be with me for the exact reason that you said.
Yeah.
I want to connect with people.
Yeah.
And I know even if I go back now over the last 6 years and I go to one of my first, 50 or 60, and I reach out to them and say, hey, I'd love to get you back on the show. Okay, update where you are right now, or I'd love to see how you're doing. There's people that I still send birthday messages to that I interviewed 300 episodes ago.
Yeah.
That we started with a connection, when I was bad and, they hadn't done a podcast before.
Yeah.
Okay, so what haven't we covered here? Because I think that I believe that there's such a powerful tool, and that, as we've covered here, companies miss out on the opportunity to use them. Individuals don't understand how they can really work for them. That if everyone was to do one, there'd be gazillions out there, but not everyone is going to.
No.
How do you get over your fear of being on camera and your fear of making audio content?
You just have it's reps and sets. There's no shortcut to it. It's like, I see your stories every day, 4:30 in the morning, driving down to the gym. I'm going to train hard today. I'm just going to get it done. It's the same with making content. You are going to be rubbish the first time. You're just going to be rubbish. First time on video, you're going to hate looking at yourself. First time you hear yourself, you're going to be like, oh, I sound really tinny or weird, or why do I sound like Barry White? But you just got to get over it. And the only way to get over it is to just do more of it. It's just that simple. But again, go into it knowing what is the end outcome. What is the thing that I'm actually doing this for? What is I like to call it my North Star. It keeps me going in the right direction regardless. It never lets me go too far wrong. And in those moments, because you will have it, the first time you sit and interview someone, you'll have the butterflies in your stomach. I've done a live podcast interview in front of, I know you've done it in front of thousands of people. I've done it in front of a couple of hundred a few weeks ago. We'd done a show in the West End. And before you walk on, you're like, why the hell am I doing this? I'm a 41-year-old man. I don't need to put myself under these pressure anymore. Like, I could literally have a heart attack now. Like, what is going on? Why am I doing this to myself? But as soon as you walk out on stage and you see the value that you created, you're like, oh, okay, cool. Now I get it. So there's no shortcut to it. You're just going to have to go through the trough of pain, because on the other side of it is potentially something that's quite life-changing. Like, a podcast genuinely changed my life, which sounds really cheesy, but I was in a place I did not want to be. And by forcing myself that first time to make a podcast, changed everything. And fast as well. Changed everything within 3 or 4 months. It was mad. And at the time I wasn't into like manifesting and spirituality and like the universe. But I was like, actually, I think there is a little bit of that that's nudged me in the right direction. I know you're a fan of all that. You love it, didn't you? Start cringing for those watching on the video, and he just cringed. Visibly just went like that, shoulders up.
Okay, to summarize then, give me 5 tips, okay, or 5 things that you believe make a successful podcast.
First things first, why are you doing this podcast? I know we've touched on it a couple of times, but you've got to understand why you're doing this podcast. Second thing, what form of education, information or entertainment are you going to give people? Mm-hmm. Number 3, I would say, are you really committed, and are you willing, and have you got the capacity and the capability to do this for a minimum of 1 year? Then I would say, to get really, really practical, make your artwork, make your little pitch deck, and start farming it out to people. I had landed Grant Cardone coming on my podcast before I even had a podcast. I had landed the guy who invented the trunky suitcase before I'd even had a podcast, because I sold them on the vision of what it was going to become. And then just do it. You just got to go out there and do your first episode, whether it be Riverside remotely, whether it be in person, face to face, whatever it's going to be. Just start doing it. Start now and get perfect later.
And what is your favourite podcast?
Unscripted with Spencer Lodge. Oh, not this one. My favourite anything from Wandery, Business Wars, and Business Movers. Oh, just in terms of narrative storytelling, it's exceptional.
But you're learning about what in particular? I don't know these podcasts.
So Business Wars is the story of like Adidas versus Puma. So they were two brothers in Germany.
Yeah, Adidas and Dassler, yeah.
It was just a phenomenal content. That's the thing that I'm really into. And from a sort of a practical point of where I'm at in my life, I think Alex Hormozy, The Game, it is so practical and tactical if you're trying to scale a business from someone who's a fair few steps ahead of where you're at, is a really good podcast. Mm-hmm. But I'd also say, like, sample lots of different things. Try if you're looking to be a podcaster. Here's a really weird tip, right? That it sounds absolutely crazy, but if you're going to start doing podcasts, whether you're going to be a guest, because guests, we've not even talked about that, going and being a guest on other people's podcasts, so powerful. But if you're going to start hosting a podcast, This is so weird. I actually do this. So I drive around a lot for work, going and doing shoot days and stuff. I will listen to a podcast and the host will ask a question and I pause it and I give my answer. So like I've been interviewed loads of times by like Stephen Bartlett.
But when you're listening, you'll pause it and give your answer. Oh, really?
Yeah. So and then I actually give my answer to that question. So I see how succinct can I be in an answer? How quick can I be with my response? How concise can I be with the information that I'm trying to give? I do that all the time.
Interesting.
All the time. Joe Rogan's interviewed me a bunch of times. He doesn't know it. I can never answer his questions either. It's a really good hack. It's a really good little hack.
To learn. Okay, let's talk about being a guest on a podcast then.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the value in being a guest?
The value in being a guest is that someone else has potentially already got an audience, and it also, by being asked questions, you can show yourself in a way that you wouldn't through your own content. So there's stuff that I've shared today that I haven't shared on other people's podcasts before. And hopefully, if the information has been useful, you've drawn the answers out of me that have made other people, potentially a new audience as well, go, God, he knows his stuff. I'm going to reach out to him. I might work with him. I should do an internal podcast. That is the most valuable thing about being a guest. And if you can do it in a way of, like Jocko Willink is a great example. Jocko Willink went on Tim Ferriss's podcast about 5 years ago. He'd never done any press or anything before. He'd been a Navy SEAL for 20 years. He wasn't allowed to do any of that sort of stuff. He's launched a consultancy, he's launched books, he's launched a media company, he's launched kids' books off the back of it, all from doing that one podcast. Because again, there's no other form of media that I know of where people get to know, like, and trust you, get to buy into you before they'll buy from you. We've been chatting for about an hour. And if people have consumed 80% of this podcast, some of them will go, God, that guy knows what he's talking about. But I've had 40 minutes-ish to build up know, like, and trust with people. There's no other, you can't get that from an article in the press. You won't get that from a YouTube video. It's unprecedentedly powerful for building your brand, I would say.
Is it better than being on Parkinson?
I'd say it is nowadays, yeah. Because the other thing is that it's a direct call to action. You know, I can say to you, thanks for having me on, Spencer. Could you put a link in the show notes? By the way, that was what I'm going to ask you to do. Go and put a link in the show notes. You can drive people there now. Parkinson can't. Parkinson, I've got to be. Is Parkinson still on? I think
he died.
I think he did actually. God rest his soul. But like, say for example, a TV show, any TV show, by the way, they could go, oh yeah, thanks very much for being on. You know, you've got to get someone from that device to search in. Whereas with a podcast, link in the show notes, which by the way, 56% of people have clicked the link in the show notes when told to do so by the host, which is 14 times more than any other call to action medium. Now they can click that link and go exactly where I want them to in one push of the button. So I think it is more powerful.
Interesting. Okay, so last question. Have I done well today?
I think you've done very well. I've been average, you've been phenomenal. Which is exactly how I expected this relationship to go.
And just by way of summarising things here, how many podcasts have you helped to launch again?
179 today.
And what's the most successful podcast you've launched?
Again, it depends on the metric that you look at. You know, if you're looking at downloads, we do probably a couple of million downloads a month across our portfolio of stuff that we edit for our clients. Realistically, we've had people that have changed their relationship with food, changed their mental health, people have stopped suicide, all sorts of stuff. It depends on the metric that you look at.
And what's your favourite one to listen to?
Of our clients, there's an amazing lady who I love called Caroline Strawson. She's phenomenally talented. She deals with narcissistic trauma and recovery. She is so intelligent, but got such an amazing way of, you know, the traffic lights of tolerance and how your physiology and your fight or flight response. But she's got a way of talking to you like you really come out of it understanding. You go, oh, I feel like that. That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, Caroline. Not that I can have favourites, but if I could, it'd be Caroline.
Have you enjoyed being on the show today?
I've loved it, yeah. I've really enjoyed it. I think this is a great space. I genuinely think that you are a very, very good host. You're at the stage of life where you don't give an F. Like, you're just going to be you. And if people come along for the ride, then great. And if not, that's also cool. And I think you've also been around the block enough times, you know how to get the best out of other people.
Okay.
And you're a very nice human being.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much.
Being.
Okay, and when you look at my content and my podcast and what I've done, okay, give me 3 tips that I can do to improve my podcast.
More clips. You need to be doing more clips.
What do you mean?
The trailers are good.
More micros.
Yeah, the trailers are good. But again, if I look at all of the stuff that we do trailers, like really sort of like Bartlett style trailers, which is what everyone's doing, by the way, Diversio style. but more clips, I'd say, of your expert opinion. You do the thing where you sort of watch someone's content and you give feedback on it. I think that's quite nice. But I think you responding in podcast format, so it's off the cuff and not pre-planned, I think that would be really good for your brand. I think that'd be the only thing I would really change with your podcast, because you just do such a good job of being with the guest, a great level of conversation. The only other thing I would suggest for you is going on more podcasts yourself, because podcast fans will, I think, come across to your show.
Okay, got it, understood. James, thank you so much for coming to join us today.
Thank you for having me on.